Welcome to our podcast, Leading Past Limits. We share lessons learned from the hard-won experience of mission-driven leaders so that you expand your horizons as a leader that places service before self. I'm Kumar Kibble, a leadership coach and the principal at GuideQuest. I've been passionate about developing leaders since graduating from West Point more than 30 years ago, and have led high-performing teams as a military officer, special agent, diplomat, government, and corporate executive. Now I partner with leaders and teams as a coach to help unlock their potential and maximize their impact. In this first season, join me in learning from entrepreneurs, CEOs, Army generals, police chiefs, war heroes, thought leaders, and more. Be sure to subscribe and don't miss out on lessons learned from the real world School of Hard Knocks. Our guest today is Chief Dan Oates. He served as the former police chief of 3 different police departments in Miami Beach, Florida, Aurora, Colorado, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. These assignments followed an illustrious 21-year career in the New York Police Department, culminating as the head of intelligence for the NYPD. He is a charter member of the Federal Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council. While with the Aurora Police Department, he was responsible for the criminal investigation of one of the largest mass shootings in American history in 2012. Dan, welcome to the show.
Kumar, it's nice to see you.
So you began professional life as a journalist. What led you into the law enforcement profession?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I kind of came of age, in the college years. We're in the 70s. And of course, it was the Watergate era. And I was incredibly inspired by the work of journalists during that period. And I had it in my mind that I was going to be a newspaper reporter for a career. And I worked did a ton of internships throughout college and was offered a job in 1977 when I graduated. I went to work for the Atlantic City Press. But as happens, I fell in love and married a wonderful woman. But in order to make that marriage succeed, I had to leave South Jersey and go to New York City because that's where she was working. And we both concluded that I was more likely to find employment there than she was to find employment in publishing in South Jersey. So the job I got in New York was working for Popular Mechanics magazine, believe it or not, as an editor. And it was interesting, but not particularly fulfilling. And I was in that job for about 2 years, casting about for something different to do, thinking going to law school, believe it or not. And the NYPD announced that they were hiring for the first time in 5 years because of the fiscal crisis of the mid-'70s. And in 1980, I joined the NYPD right at the beginning of a huge hiring boom. And I did it kind of on a whim just to try something different. The idea really started to grow on me while I was going through the application process. And living in Manhattan, it was an exciting time, young, married, no kids. And I took the plunge and it changed my life, all for the better. I've had a wonderful, marvelous law enforcement career, all because of that experience in the NYPD and that start. So,
and you've touched a number of different bases and a number of different areas, taking on different challenges along the way. What challenges did you face at the beginning of your career, beginning in law enforcement?
Well, the NYPD was going through significant change. It hadn't hired any new cops in 5 years. When I joined the department, it was largely white, largely male, a lot of Vietnam veteran folks, and a lot of people who had been through the layoffs of the 70s. In 1975, or 1973 or so, the NYPD laid off 5,000 or 6,000 cops. And those who wanted back eventually were hired back through the 70s. But it was a very embittered workforce that I joined. And we were these young folks coming on board, many of us college educated, a very, very diverse group, of the first significant influx of minority men and women, the first significant influx of women into the NYPD in the sworn ranks. And a lot of that was a function of federal court orders as a result of challenges to the hiring process and sort of proven discrimination in the hiring process in the past. And so we were a radically different, post-Vietnam. Most of us hadn't served, hadn't been in the military, and generally higher levels of education. And it was an upheaval within the NYPD. And between 1980 and 1986, something like 15,000 of us were hired. Wow. So it was a total radical change to how the NYPD operated, or the talent and the diversity of talent that joined the organization. And I got hired right at the beginning of that hiring boom. And so what happened was I get hired in 1980. 1983, they need sergeants. I take the sergeant's exam, and boom, 1984, I'm a sergeant. 1987, I'm a lieutenant. 1992, I'm a captain. So I zipped through, and there were about 90 of us who hit the tests just right and went from police officer to executive. The lowest rank in the executive corps in the NYPD is captain. That there are about 90 or 100 of us who went through the ranks like that in about 10 to 12 years. And really interesting, Kumar, 1980s, New York City crime was out of control. Mm-hmm. And remember, the crack boom starts in 1984, and it's just crazy how dangerous and violent and crime-ridden New York City was. But there's no more fun than to be a street cop when crime is like that. Right. But I was a street cop in the 80s, and it was a blast. Yeah. I also was very fortunate. I won a scholarship because I was a cop, and I went to law school in the 80s. From 82 to 86, I went at night, and I managed somehow to get a law degree, and that really propelled my career. And then in 1992, I become a captain, and Bill Bratton comes in January of 1994 with Rudy Giuliani as the new mayor. Bill Bratton is the new police commissioner, and as you know, in policing, Bill in New York City changed the world. Data-driven decision-making, strategic deployment around crime, ComStat, all of those initiatives. So the second half of my NYPD career, I was an executive, moving through the more senior ranks during the most exciting time in the NYPD's history, where we were successfully driving down crime. And learned a lot from Bill, who's a remarkable leader. And to this day, we're friends, and I still do some work with him and seek his counsel regularly. So I just had a great time. Street cop in the 80s when crime was out of control, and that was a blast. And an executive in the 90s when it was palpable the way we were changing the city and making it safer. And so, I've just been very, very blessed. And from there, Bill in particular, but in general, my colleagues in the NYPD inspired me to try and be an executive myself and run an agency. And I took the plunge and left right before 9/11. I left the NYPD and arrived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right before 9/11 to become a police chief. And then the three jobs over 18 years as a police chief, 3 different cities, 3 iconic cities, great experience.
So Dan, before we explore that further, tell me, there must have been the accelerated movement through the ranks, all the things going on, the challenges, the public safety challenges in the city at the time, the transition of integrating workforce with higher education from a more diverse background. There must have been challenges and setbacks encountered along the way. I mean, would you describe some of them and what you learned from them?
Well, in the NYPD, they have a very interesting approach to executive positions in the rank of captain and above. If they think you're right for a job, there's not much discussion, kind of like the military, not much discussion about whether or not you think you're right for the job or you're fit for the job. Here you go. And on day one, you're expected to run the organization. I'll tell you a funny story. I'm the brand new head of the NYPD Intelligence Division. Okay. I was very junior ranked when I got the job. Howard Safer, the police commissioner at the time, took a leap of faith with me when he gave me the organization to run and asked me to make some major change. And it is literally my first day in the office. Okay. Mm-hmm. And 2 letter bombs show up at the United Nations. Now, one of your jobs as the head of intelligence for the NYPD is you are the point of contact and lead liaison for the NYPD to the entire diplomatic community. Mm-hmm. And as far as the police commissioner and the senior command staff is, you're supposed to have all the answers when there's a diplomatic event immediately. Mm-hmm. So I am literally in the office. I got there super early, 5 in the morning. I'm unpacking, I'm putting all my stuff in place, and I'm trying to get to know people. And I get the phone call, "Hey, boss, got 2 letter bombs at the UN. Let's go." So we're racing from lower Brooklyn up to the United Nations, and I have no idea what I'm supposed to do when I get there. But that's the kind of thing you events you are thrown into in the NYPD. There was a moment in my career where I know for a fact that the police commissioner, earlier moment in my career, as a young captain, when the police commissioner was thinking of me to head the mounted unit. I only found out about it afterwards. Okay, I don't know a damn thing about horses, other than that I'm terrified of them because I had experience as a adolescent riding a horse that got out of control, on some trip out west or something. So, but that's the way it is. If they decide you're right for a job, then you find your way through it. But in a way, excellent training for how to be an executive, how to cope with that which you do not know. And of course, one of the life lessons for me in all those experiences, including the 3 departments I ran, and something I always preach to this day to young sergeants when they become sergeants, is don't think because you're a boss and you have the authority that you have to make all the decisions. The talent around you can guide you through just about any crisis. If you turn around and ask people, what advice do you have about how to handle this crisis right now, or this problem, or this issue? You'll find that the people in the lower ranks, the people who do the work every day, will guide you. And not only that, they'll appreciate A, that you asked, and B, that as a result of asking, you're taking the team in the right direction. Sort of never more true than when I got promoted to sergeant in 1984, and they sent me to the busiest, most violent precinct in New York City, 3-4 in northern Manhattan. And I was working late tours because I was going to law school, so I had to have steady shifts, and that was the only shift that was available, was a midnight shift. And everyone who worked for me, the 30 or 5 or so cops who turned out every night, everyone who worked for me had a minimum of 10 or 12 years on the job, and I was a brand new sergeant with 4 years on the job. And I learned very quickly, these guys knew a lot more about policing than I did. And all they wanted out of a boss was someone to make smart decisions based on good information and listen to their advice. And I learned really, really quickly that talking to them about how to handle this shooting or this multiple car accident or any of these things and the steps that had to be taken. And it's a life lesson that I applied in all my jobs going forward. I mean, as a new chief, you come into a new city, you don't know the city, you don't know any of the dynamics and the power influences in that city, and you got to rely on the people around you. And that's a really, really important leadership lesson that I learned, from my time in the NYPD.
Yeah, what you say resonates, because I remember when I reported as a new lieutenant into the 82nd Airborne Division and took over this platoon of paratroopers that had jumped into Panama and had been in Desert Storm. I gathered the NCOs who had, obviously I'm a butter bar, I've got no experience. And I said, look, your job is to teach me to be the leader you deserve.
That's a great line. Yeah. And without using that language, that's kind of the philosophy I took. And I'll tell you this, every single person who got promoted to sergeant in each of the 3 agencies I ran for 18 years, I had a sit down private conversation with them. I tried to do it over a breakfast or a lunch, and just spent the hour sort of talking about those kinds of experiences that I had as a young sergeant, young lieutenant, and trying to share with them and tell them that my 2 important messages were: one is rely on the people around you. They know the business if you just ask, and be patient. And the other thing in policing is don't rush. There's very, very few moments in policing when you have to make an instant decision as a leader. One of the important skills is to know when to slow down everybody and everything. Unless there's hostages behind a door and shots are being fired, there's almost no circumstance where you've got to rush in. And the best way to keep your people safe, is to take your time, be deliberative, and take in a lot of input and ask for a lot of advice and help.
Let me ask you, when you earlier referenced, coming into a new city, and there's all these things going on that you're not familiar with. I know that, major city police chiefs face, this broad range of stakeholders that have an interest in how policing is impacting the community and so on. There's just pressures, it strikes me, pressures from every side, every angle. Do you have any strategies or any things you lean into to stay resilient, and to just to weather the pressures?
Well, it's interesting. Interesting. You use the word resilient. I think the shelf life of a police chief is about 5 years. There is a point at which um, the agency needs a change, and you need a change. There are only so many times you can try and achieve something, and if something still needs to be changed in the organization, or how the department relates to the city and the community, and you've tried 3 times and you failed, it's and you begin to feel that as a police chief. There's a point in which, yeah, it's time to move on. I need a new set of problems, a new set of folks to deal with, and this organization does too. And I've probably accomplished about all I can here. You don't get hired as a police chief by another agency unless the agency has problems. It takes a lot for a city to say, we're not going to hire from within. And typically when you come in, you're brought in because it's perceived by the decision makers, the elected decision makers in the city, that the talent isn't there to move the organization forward in a certain way, and we have to go outside. The other thing that happens when you come in as an outsider to a police organization is there's a lot of resistance to the outsider. Everyone wishes it was an insider. The joke in the profession among leadership is that the only thing that cops hate more than the status quo is change. And I find that to be very true. And in each of the cities that I went into, there was a clear mandate. You're being brought in here, Oates, to make changes. Typically they were around accountability. They were around leadership. They were around relating to the community and being more responsive and more to and respectful of the community, more responsive to and more respectful of the elected leadership. And those are challenges when you come in as an outsider, because pretty much the general rule of thumb is the cops would have preferred someone from the inside. So it's a tough circumstance to come into. And yeah, you need to be resilient. And, in terms of strategy, the best advice I would have for someone who would do that today is you've got to put in the time. It's 12-hour days. It's meeting with everyone. It's doing the listening tour for the first 3 months, where you try and reassure everyone you're dealing with, whether it's the community, and particularly the cops, everyone. Listen, I'm not going to make any radical changes. I have to learn about you and the organization and the needs of the community. And so give me time, and be reassured that I'm not going to do anything wild and crazy and stupid by way of major change without knowing the organization and the challenges it faces in the community. So that's been my lesson. And each time I did it as an outsider, because I came in 3 times, I think each time I got a little better at it. And in the process, I found that as hard as and challenging that was the most fun. Coming in as an outsider, because an organization needs reform, needs change, and everyone sort of acknowledges that. Even the cops acknowledge it. It's a lot of fun to find your way, meet new folks, spend the time listening, learning about the sort of the culture of the community, and then beginning to fashion, remedies, solutions, collaborate.
So let me ask you. So that I think that you are uniquely positioned in terms of having assumed command of several different police departments. You talked about the importance of the listening tour and kind of acknowledging and being prepared to overcome resistance, internal resistance. What are other things that you do as far as once you've gathered the information, kind of how do you set a vision? How do you chart a new course? What specifically do you do to get buy-in for a new policy direction or whatever the change may be?
Well, first of all, for your audience, policing is kind of a unique culture. The stratified paramilitary way of doing things. The chief the chief holds inordinate sway in a police department. My sense is much more than, say, in a private corporation. Um, People hang on every word that you say as a police chief. And one of the lessons as a newbie police chief is learning to keep your mouth shut sometimes. You might say things that, you and I would joke and say in a normal conversation, and you would understand, my effort at humor, and some folks would take, when you're brand new in an organization, it's I'm a northeastern liberal kind of guy. I grew up in New York City, and I arrive in the Midwest in a Big Ten college town, and there were some cultural differences in way I acted and the way I was interpreted, and you learn over time to be more circumspect. In terms of building sort of a vision for the organization, I've tried all the tricks. But today, my approach would be, if I were to take over another organization, I struggle with I start off by saying I struggle with big time 5-year strategic plans. Okay. My experience has been those things sit on shelves. All right. I tend to think in terms of what is the organization, what should it be trying to accomplish in the next 3 months and in the next year.
Okay.
And what I adopted as a practical working strategy for my leadership team in Aurora, and I think I was even more effective in Miami Beach, is a planning day or maybe a planning days retreat every 3 months. And the conversation during those 3 months, those planning sessions would be, what's happened in the last 3 months? What's our reaction to it? Where are we with the initiatives we talked about 3 months ago in our last meeting? What do we plan to accomplish in the next 3 months? And where do we want to be a year from now? And then, being a police department, there are categories that are terribly important to talk about whenever you get the team together: hiring and recruitment, effectiveness of investigations, basic patrol deployment, relationships with the community, and whether or not we're doing more and enough or need to try some different initiatives. So the strategy I found that was most effective over time after 18 years as a police chief was that strategy. I've never quite gotten the notion of big time 5-year strategic plans. And maybe
I think it's
something about me and the way I approach.
It's been my experience as well. And I think the thing is that what we do is pretty complex and there's so many variables.
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to have the foresight to anticipate all of that. I love what you outlined because it's very agile and you can adapt as things that are unforeseen emerge. Where did you learn it? I mean, did you learn that at the NYPD? Did you develop that over time yourself?
I think of hard knocks over 18 years as a police chief, coming in 3 times to outside agencies. I will tell you this, another thing I share with folks who are competing for police chief jobs. If you want to, typically police chiefs are hired by city managers. Typical, 80% of cities in America, there's an elected board, which is your mayor and city council, but there's a professional CEO who runs the city, typically a city manager. Maybe 20% of the time, the CEO is the elected mayor. Like in New York City, the CEO is the elected mayor. But many, many cities in this country, Miami, Dallas, the mayor doesn't run the city. The city's run by a city manager. And each of the 3 cities I worked in, I worked for a city manager. And I used to joke, but not, somewhat serious with candidates. I said, if you get to the interview stage with the city manager, if you want to impress the hell out of him, that you know what it means to be a police chief, tell him you won't take the job until you meet with the budget director and talk about the resources that are going to be available to you, the city attorney, and talk about the legal support you're going to get to run the police department, and the director of human resources for the city. Because you're going to spend 70% of your time as a police chief dealing with budget, HR, and legal. And if you want to impress the hell out of a city manager and you're a candidate for a job, just go in and say, these things are really important to me, and I won't have a comfort level taking the job, Mr. Manager, unless we get to that point where I can get a sense of how the police chief interacts with those entities and what kind of support there will be, because I know that stuff is crucial to running an organization. And of course, None of those three things, except maybe only indirectly, actually are about deploying cops on the street, responding to calls for service, et cetera. But that's the stuff of managing a police department these days. And if you think about it, especially today, in light of where we are and where policing is in America. And that's just something I learned over time. That's where you, I'll use the term win important battles that influence the organization in the direction it goes. Can you win the fights over who you hire and who you terminate? Can you win some of the legal battles when the department is sued because of X or Y, or there's some new direction you want to go in that has legal implications? And can you win, frankly, the advocacy and the fight for resources every year, because every year you go through a very challenging budget cycle that typically takes months, involves lots of public hearings before the elected officials. And there's a great debate going on in American society today about how much resources should go to the police. And that's what democracy is about. And if you're going to be an advocate for your agency, you've got to stand up in the public forum and say, it's really important that we spend this amount of money on training, or that we purchase this important protective gear for our cops, or whatever. Or if you want us to wear body cameras, understand that the true cost of body cameras for an agency is a lot more than buying a camera. It's storage, it's personnel to go through requests for public records. I mean, those are the kinds of things you do as a police chief, and they consume a lot of your time.
When you were, whether it's either of those, any of those departments, did you ever see something that you thought was critical to the future of the department that you had to build support for, that maybe it wasn't so obvious to people within the department or the city manager? Did you ever run into anything like that?
The answer is yes, again and again and again. And I'll talk about one element, one experience that I'm particularly proud of, and a legacy in two agencies. But the answer is yes all the time. I had, in all three departments, challenges around officers who were addicted to alcohol, okay, and whose lives were in the process of being ruined. And I had cops I had to fire because of actions they took and decisions they made while intoxicated. And I had a moment out in the parking lot talking to a veteran cop, a spectacular cop in Aurora, who was a recovering alcoholic, had been sober for 20 years. And I went to him for advice about one of my cops who was in crisis because of decisions she had made and actions she had taken while intoxicated. And I was facing the typical, how do I rescue an employee at the same time as discipline her for her behavior? And the cop's name was Tom Abbott. And Tom said to me in the parking lot, Chief, the problem with our alcohol program in Aurora is the problem everywhere. What will be offered to her, she's in crisis. And because she's in crisis and she's so deeply dependent on alcohol and she's having so many problems, she has no time on the books, okay? She has no money. She needs inpatient treatment for her alcohol abuse. And in typical fashion, our city is offering outpatient treatment. Mm-hmm. And she cannot succeed with outpatient treatment. She needs to go in. She can't use any sick time because she has none, because this is a typical problem for folks, in this kind of, in extremis around their alcoholism. You need to find a way, if you really want to solve this problem, and this was probably, I had been there at that point 5-6 years, and we had 4 or 5 cops, some of whom had lost their careers because of events. And Tom said, you got to find a way to cover her without regard to medical cost, insurance programs, whether or not she has time on the books, whether or not she can afford it. You got to find a way to get her into inpatient treatment. And I did. I cut a few corners and maybe didn't tell my boss everything I was doing, but I found a way. But eventually I went to my boss and said, what Tom told me is so powerful. We need to set this up as a regular funded program for the entire PD, and better yet, for the entire 2,400 people in the city workforce. And we did. I had a tremendously receptive city manager, and the cost was, in the end, if you build it right, relatively minor. And in a workforce of 2,400 employees, I think by the time I left, we were averaging 5 or 6 city employees a year. Who, you raise your hand and say, "I've got a problem," and we moved you right into inpatient treatment and post inpatient treatment. 30-day program, post treatment, outpatient treatment, and we were rescuing lives for a relatively modest expense. And I was able to duplicate that. Eventually, I had to start from scratch when I got to Miami Beach, but I got there in the same place in Miami Beach. So that's an example of identifying a need and working towards a solution that's compassionate, and it's about protecting your employees. And one of the things I think I'm most proud of in my time. Another was building a top shelf peer support programs in both agencies with the help of outside professionals and the full support of my bosses. So
yeah. What about when you've had something that's concerns that are being kind of imposed from outside the organization that are not popular with the rank and file?
In policing?
What do you,
Oh, come on. Actually,
Yeah.
that happens all the time.
Right.
And it's part of the challenge. Now, really, really interesting. I think the best example in recent years was the introduction of body cameras, as you might imagine. Okay.
Right.
So I had the good fortune of when I arrived in Ann Arbor back in 2001 that we had dash cameras in a handful of patrol cars. Okay. It was the old VHS. The machine was in the trunk of the car, and you plugged the tapes in, and we had mountains of storage of tapes and all of that. But by the time I got to Ann Arbor, what I found was that the cops who were assigned to traffic enforcement, I had a handful, typically 1 or 2 on every shift. The cops assigned to traffic enforcement loved the cameras. The rank and file cops didn't want anything to do with the dash cam cars. But the cops who did traffic enforcement and know what it was like to have false complaints made against them.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
They had a microphone on them and they had the dash cam camera. And again and again, people would come in and complain to us about how they were treated by an officer. The cops all knew they were being videotaped, and we'd pull out the videotape, and the people would leave sheepishly, from my office after watching the video and realizing the cop was professional. So I learned early on that properly run cameras, cops will eventually embrace because they protect cops, right?
Yeah.
So I get to Aurora, and circa, I guess it would have been 2011, we start to experiment with body cameras, body worn cameras. And so what did I learn? Roll it out with the traffic cops. And I had a very strong, vibrant motorcycle unit. We had 160 miles, a lot of traffic dangers, and cops, stopping cars and writing tickets all the time, because that's part of what we do in enforcement to control behavior. And, not surprisingly, the motorcycle cops took to the body cameras fairly quickly. And sure enough, we had an incident early on where a cop was literally threatened by someone, and it was captured on camera. And we ended up locking him up for threatening the cop. And of course, I marketed that to the entire department. And just as I was leaving in 2014, we were starting to roll cameras out to patrol, still with a lot of resistance. But I already knew that I had built, some advocacy. And I think that's the trick, is to build advocacy somehow, find your way to build advocacy within the organization for a seemingly unpopular and actually unpopular but necessary change in the organization. And when I got to Miami Beach, I was brought in with a mandate to put body cameras on cops. And I arrived in Miami Beach 2 months before Ferguson. Okay. Right when, the current changed perspective on law enforcement in American society, began to change. And I had fierce resistance from Miami Beach cops to wearing body cameras. So we took the methodical approach, lots of dialogue with the union around policy, rolling it out very, very slowly with the highest exposure cops first, who would most likely say, "I'm glad I was wearing a body camera that day." And every agency's been through this now. Every enlightened large agency has body cameras now. Lots of challenges around implementation. But I guarantee you today, if you tried to take body cameras away from Aurora cops or Miami Beach cops, they would scream because they know the value and they've seen the value of documenting their own actions from their own perspective. And plus, in addition, today now everybody's got a camera, and you take any action on the street, somebody's filming it anyway. But the professional, the resistance within the profession to the rollout of body cameras, beginning in American policing around 2012, 2013, 2014, was overwhelming. How can I do my job? And of course you can.
Right. Well, so let's talk about. Let's bring that up to the present day, where there's so much talk about police reform.
Right.
What do you think are the key things that should be prioritized as we move that discussion forward?
Well, what's really frustrating for police executives as we watch this is, and first of all, I'll give my speech that I've given every setting that I can. As a profession today, we've never been better educated, better trained, more diverse, okay, better led, with better equipment, better tactics, and more experience based on things that have gone wrong over the years and how we've adapted and adjusted than we are today. And yet the narrative in American society today is that we are out of control, okay, and we're a terrible profession and we're not improving. When in fact, my experience in 30 plus years as a police executive, moving through the ranks and working in 4 iconic cities, and then going to the police chiefs conferences, the 2 national conferences a year and the state conferences periodically, is that it's a remarkable crew of American leaders in policing that are constantly trying to improve themselves. I wish for 2 things. I wish that folks who are hypercritical of the profession could attend some of those police chiefs conferences and sit in on those seminars, as you have, and seen the earnestness with which the top professionals in our business meet and try and discuss and solve problems. And the other thing I wish somehow people could see is what I've seen over the years, and you've seen, I know, from your career, is the time and time and time again where cops, faced with opportunities on the street to make choices, have chosen not to use force, have found a way to avoid using deadly force and avoid injuring people who are in crisis or out to hurt them. And of course, those heroic stories that go on every single day in American society. For instance, there is a national discussion about whether or not the cops should respond to deal with issues involving homeless people who are acting in aberrant behavior that's disturbing to the community, okay? That it should be social workers. Well, cops are social workers. And I had an incredibly strong homeless outreach unit in Miami Beach, a sergeant, 4 cops, and a former civilian, former homeless guy with a criminal record and all of those things, who had sobered up and devoted his life to caring for the homeless, and just an extraordinary human being who was capable of talking sometimes to people in a way that the cops could not. And that team, those 6 people, the whole 5 years I was in Miami Beach, they were out there doing incredible rescues of homeless people in crisis. And yeah, they were cops, and yeah, they had guns, because sometimes when you're out at 2 a.m. and you're going to places we're getting complaints about, there's a certain percentage of folks who need to be arrested because they're violating trespass laws, et cetera. They're wanted sex offenders, et cetera. But we never heard any stories about bad things happening with the homeless population in Miami Beach in their treatment by the police officers in the 5 years I was there, because of this extraordinary team.
So Dan, how does that story, that more complete story, get communicated to the public at large? Because what I am concerned about is this narrative that's being pushed by some people with an agenda could actually result in things that are not helpful in terms of retaining and recruiting talented people that bring good judgment to these situations. How do we balance out that narrative?
It's a real challenge. I don't have an easy solution. There's efforts now to throw cops out of schools. I mean, I had I'll tell two stories. I had two cops working in high schools in Ann Arbor. Only two. I had two SROs, one in each of the two major high schools with 2,500 kids in them. Okay. They were among the most respected adults in the school. They weren't part of the administration, so they weren't handing out discipline. Okay.
Right.
They were a reassuring ear to any young adolescent who just wanted to talk to an adult. And they were beloved. I had a terrible tragedy occur in one of the high schools in Ann Arbor where two kids snuck out, during class. They went and they were playing around in daddy's basement, one of the kids. They found a shotgun, and by mistake, one kid killed the other with the shotgun. That kid ran back to the high school to tell the one adult in his life he trusted, which was the Ann Arbor police officer, what had occurred.
Mm.
Okay.
Wow.
In Aurora, I had 26 cops assigned to the schools. Big city with a whole bunch of schools. And I preached that this is a community. We have our neighborhoods, et cetera. Well, the two school districts are its own kind of special kind of community, and these are the community beat officers for those schools. And the principals and the administration and the students love those cops. And yeah, did they occasionally make arrests? Yeah, but the safest place to make a mistake as a young man or woman is in the school, not outside the school, and the cops were there for them. So this narrative that somehow cops shouldn't be in the schools when they provide so much level of protection, and we also live in the world of violence and guns and active shooters and mass shootings. It's something I struggle with. But as a chief, as an executive, as a leader of the organization that delivers this kind of service, the answer is I think you have to tout the positives. You have to celebrate the successes, find a way. It's easier and easier to find a way now with social media and all the different platforms. And sophisticated police agencies are using social media to do that and just keep pushing the narrative that your people are doing good work. And the other thing you got to do as a police chief is you've got to work the community. You've got to be spending, every 3 months a lunch with the head of the Chamber of Commerce, a lunch with the superintendent of schools. You name the 3 or 4 biggest businesses, you've got to be spending time with them, spending time with each of the elected city council members, and constantly basically cheerleading, informing about what the department's up to, and cheerleading. And
Dan, is there an example you could share on that? Because I think that's so important, that investment in that personal relationship and connection that kind of that basically builds trust, so that someone is more inclined to give you the benefit of the doubt. Is there anything that comes to mind?
In Aurora, very big community, 350,000 residents, 2 major school districts. One of them very, very challenged. Aurora was a big city on the eastern edge of Denver and sprawling for 165 square miles to the east and to the south. Okay. Half of the city, very challenged school district, probably outside of the Denver school district, the most challenged in terms of poverty, second language issues, et cetera, in all of Colorado, and underperforming. Well, they recruited a retired a major general from the Air Force, a fighter pilot named John Barry. He was in that Broad Academy, training for folks to become school superintendents. And I had learned over time that one of the most important relationships you have, because one of the most important communities you police is your schools. And so I worked the relationship with John and got to know him really, really well. There were all kinds of challenges on a regular basis because of the population he served and some of the decisions kids made and the trouble they got into. Well, we were talking, John and I were probably talking around policing issues and service delivery to his schools at least 4 times a week. And then the Aurora Theater shooting happens. So it happens, and there's 1,100 people in the theater. There's 300 something people in the theater where the shooting occurs, but the larger complex is 1,100. And it's the first night of the Batman movie in 2012. The theater's full of students. It's full of kids. Okay. And they're John's kids. And they're, as you might imagine, horribly traumatized by what occurred. But that investment in building a relationship with a key community leader who's part of one of the most important segments that we deliver services to, that personal relationship. And John and I were on the phone continuously or seeing each other in the days and weeks ahead about how to, frankly, cope as a community and deliver support services to his educational community in the aftermath of that event, because we had built that relationship of trust. And in policing, that's what you do as a police chief, is you get out there in that community and you build trust and goodwill, and you build it and you build it and you build it, because you never know when you're going to have to cash it in. Because let's face it, we are in a tough business where there's always a bad outcome around the corner. And we may have nothing to do with causing the bad outcome, but we're in the middle of it because we're the police. And we're expected to help the community arise out of that bad outcome and manage the damage as much as we can.
Well, Dan, you raised that example around the Aurora Theater shooting. Would you please share a little more about the background of that, and then the unique challenges that you had to address in managing that incident?
All right. Well, the very short narrative is that it's just after midnight on July 20th, 2012, and the shooter goes into the crowded theater on the premiere of Batman Returns, Dark Knight Rises, or something like that was the name of the movie. And he had planned this out, and he opens fire in the theater. He shoots 70 people, kills 12, one of whom was carrying an unborn baby, and wounds 58. And our response was superb, and we capture him outside the theater right after he's done shooting. And the cops were extraordinarily responsive to the situation and well-trained, and made the decision 8 minutes in to transport the most critically wounded to the nearby hospitals. And they transported 27 who were critically wounded, who the paramedics in the chaos couldn't get to, and all 27 of them lived. So one of the stories, one of the narratives that became part of American policing after 2012, which I am very proud of, is if you can't get the EMS folks to where the wounded are in a critical event like that, get the wounded out, teach tactical combat care, stop the bleeding care, and get them to hospitals as soon as possible. And American policing follows that model to this day based on the Aurora example. So then it's all about the victims. Now, additionally, in our case, because we had a live defendant, it's also about convicting the defendant. And I could talk for hours about what that means in terms of running an investigation. But putting that aside, now you have, and we've seen this again and again and again since 2012, now you have an entire community that's victimized. It isn't just the people in the theater, it's everyone they know and love. And effectively, it's the entire community. And then it's a lot of hard work. And in the early days, which is really, really intimidating, is all the focus is on the police chief, because the police chief leads the narrative of what occurred and what's going to occur prospectively for the first couple of days. It's just natural that's how it turns out. That in itself was an extraordinary pressure, but it's really about mobilizing all the resources of community to provide care. Care to the families who have lost someone, care to the families of people who are wounded, and it's comprehensive care. It's all kinds of stuff you wouldn't think of. It's picking people up at the airport if that's what it takes, because there's funerals. It's running, the funerals. It's getting psychological help, somehow managing that for anybody who's victimized, including especially among the population that's victimized is your own cops.
Right.
And all the city workers and if you have a high performing government, which we did, Aurora is a great city, and we had a high performing city government that coalesces around key leaders in city government, including the police chief and everybody, all the major directors and the city manager. And if it's a high performing government, the elected officials realize the importance of that and support it. No matter the cost. It was the transformative moment of my professional career, as you might imagine. But as I've preached since, no one really believes in the back of their mind that this is going to happen to me as a police chief and to my department. The odds are not there. Of course, the odds are
Right.
growing because we're having more and more of these. But back in 2012, ours was at that time the largest mass shooting in terms of victims in U.S. history. It's now been eclipsed by Pulse and by Las Vegas and by all these other events, unfortunately, and tremendously traumatizing. And it takes forever to climb out of it. But in fact, I tell the story that about 6 months later, as a community, we're just climbing out of this, and Newtown happened. Ours is July of 2012, and Newtown is December of 2012, and there was a collective crushing depression in the Aurora community, watching another community go through what we had been through. So resiliency, we literally created the Aurora Resilience Center in the Afterwood for community members to seek psychological help, and I think it still operates to this day. But there are a lot of challenges around that kind of tragedy.
Is there anything, when you look back on it, I mean, not necessarily 2020 hindsight, just kind of thinking through what you knew at the time, are there any things that you would have done differently or handled differently?
I'm sure I could have spent more energy, on my cops. I mean, I have a whole takeaways discussion about lessons learned, things we didn't expect, like the efforts at defrauding people who are trying to give money to support the victims. I mean, I could go on with a list like that.
Yeah.
Not realizing that cops are so traumatized that they can't write a decent police report of their observations. In the first 12 hours, you got to give them time. I mean, all kinds of little lessons like that. In terms of big lessons, I think we did a real good job with the media. I think we did a real good job serving the victims. I'm not sure we spent enough energy, as much as we tried. I'm not sure we spent enough energy on the trauma that our cops had been through. I think we came to that realization, weeks out. And we did a lot of really good things because we had a top shelf professional advising us, but we probably could have done more. It may seem trivial now, but we neglected the local media to our detriment. We paid attention to the national media in the first couple of days. And I think there was some lingering resentment that before there was a gag order in place and we couldn't talk anymore, we didn't spend any significant time with local media. And then, 3 days in, the district attorney got a gag order and we weren't allowed to talk about the case. There all kinds of little mistakes like that. But I think we were fairly well prepared for an agency that really doesn't believe it's going to happen to us, which is every agency in police.
Right.
But obviously, more and better training is always good. Tactical combat care training, which is now, I think, very, very common. We didn't spend any energy on that. My cops didn't have tourniquets issued to them in 2012. Now, most enlightened police departments issue tourniquets to everyone and train them on them. So, I mean, there are hundreds of lessons.
Yeah. Let me shift gears a little bit because, I mean, throughout our conversation, we keep coming back to connections with community, with key stakeholders and so on. I mean, we're now in a post-George Floyd atmosphere. What do you, I mean, I know that you successfully built strong relationships with minority communities, certainly as Aurora Police Department. I don't know how that unfolded in Miami Beach. What, in your experiences, what worked well and what do you think is particularly relevant to how we move forward today in a low trust, environment?
Well, on a personal level, what worked well in all three cities was seeking out, as soon as I arrived, the key leaders from the key interest groups that had the biggest issues with the police department and meeting them, spending time with them, and establishing relationships with them. So on a personal level, that's really, really important for police chiefs to do. And I managed somehow, even though I consider myself somewhat introverted, I managed somehow to reach out to people, typically from very, very different backgrounds than my own, and spending the time. I found, for instance, that when it came to some of African American ministers, it's really, really important to go to church. It's
Mhm.
really, really important to sit through those 3-hour Baptist services, and that's an investment. But every single time I went, I I learned something. I had some moments of real laughs and joys, and I learned a lot about that community over time by doing that. So that's an example. For some folks, it was about sharing meals. The Muslim community in Ann Arbor, a very significant Muslim community that frankly had been undervalued by the community as a whole and ignored by the police department before I arrived. Important in that community was to spend time having a meal with folks, and again attending their services. I was the first police chief to attend the local mosque for a service, and that's precinct commander 101 in Brooklyn, which is where my last
Mhm.
stop was before I left. But never entered the mind of a single police officer in Ann Arbor or executive to go to the mosque and attend services and address the congregation. So that kind of effort by the chief is really important. Then the other big thing, if you're having problems with the community, is finding way for cops to end up in settings with their critics where they can be themselves and talk about what they do. Um, I've always found that if the setting is right and it's safe, that if a cop attends a meeting and meets with someone in the community and talks about what he or she does, who they are, where they came from, what their training is, and what they worry about and do every day, then their professionalism, their decency, and humanity will come through. So if
Yeah.
you can create settings where cops talk to people who are their critics about what they do and why, and by the way, simultaneously listen to the critics and why they're critics, um, that breaks down barriers, builds a certain level of trust and understanding that's really, really valuable. I mean, if you're, and I
Mhm.
had a couple of these in Ann Arbor and Aurora, I actually staged formal facilitated sessions like this because I came into communities that were in crisis around their relationships with particularly the Black community. You're a cop and you hear a 17-year-old or 18-year-old young lady talk about how she was stopped by the police and how terrified she was. You know, there's a good chance a whole lot of cops in America have never heard that directly
Yeah.
from a 17 or 18-year-old kid, and felt that passion, and come to an understanding of what might be in the head of someone in that circumstance. And that 18-year-old hears what the cop's version of a car stop and what he worries about when he's approaching the car at a car stop and why he's concerned about traffic safety and speeding and all those kinds of things. Um, when that cop leaves that session, that stays in the back of his mind for the rest of his career. That these are among the people that I stop and issue tickets to, and maybe there's room for and a need for a little bit more compassion, a little bit more patience, explaining what the car stop was about, et cetera, and that's really powerful. And the young lady leaves the session feeling the decency and humanity of that police officer and beginning to change her perspective on all cops. So, there's work to be done as a police executive. There's work to be done to get your cops exposed. And then there's pitching or advocating to the people in between, making your sergeants, your lieutenants, and your senior commanders understand their role in building relationships and advocating and creating goodwill for the department.
Dan, how would you, I mean, knowing you came out of NYPD, and which pioneered CompStat, kind of this data-driven
Right.
approach, you mentored me, when I was a special agent in charge in Colorado, when I was thinking about how to adapt things that I thought might be helpful. What are indicators that give a chief a sense of the state of relationship with minority communities? I mean, are there certain data points or key performance indicators that you could look at and go, okay, this is moving in the wrong direction, or this is moving in the right direction?
Well, first off, if there's a crisis, it's how your critics react to that crisis. I mean, that's
Mhm.
clearly an indicator. They give you a break? Do they give you a moment to explain? I preach uh, again that idea of building up goodwill.
Yeah.
There is goodwill towards the police department in a community, including, say, among the biggest critics in the community. then when something happens that's controversial, such as an officer-involved shooting, if you can pick up the phone and call key leaders and say, I need time, we're going to investigate this. Trust me, you're going to get an explanation, but I need time. If the goodwill is there, then those folks who might traditionally be critics won't come out and blast you in the press right away and leap to conclusions. So when there's a crisis, that's a good indicator. Is how do people respond in a crisis? Another good indicator is, those folks are in the community. That means they're in the community. They're having regular and periodic contact with the police, or if, say, it's a minister or it's a school superintendent, their constituents are having regular contact with the police. It's the signals you get in your contact with these folks, in your dialogue with them, what the little stories that they're telling you about their community's interrelation with the police and whether or not that's going well or not so well. And again, I preached you take advantage of every opportunity to accrue goodwill. I mean, the little things like we towed a car we shouldn't have towed. Okay, someone's parked car we shouldn't have towed. Clearly, we made a mistake. All right, what's the tow fee? The tow fee is $150. Okay, you check with the city manager. Is there some way we can eat that tow fee out of our budget rather than charge these folks? That kind of thing. There's all kinds of little gestures that you can do that have outsized influence in what people think of the organization. If there was another big thing is if there's a tragedy in a community, is that you're sending a message. Some young child is killed as a result of a car accident, that you're expressing the condolences of the police department, quickly and sincerely to that community, and you're showing up for the funeral and you're doing all those kinds of things. Those gestures count in terms of building goodwill and therefore building a level of communication. I always preached, and everybody has their definition of community policing. If you go for a job interview as a police chief, they ask you, Chief, how do you feel about community policing? And typically the people asking the question don't know anything about community policing. And I always expressed, and I said, community policing is not a bike patrol program or a neighborhood watch program. Those are outcomes if the community demands that kind of thing. True community policing is cops are so immersed in an individual neighborhood or community that they're known and trusted and respected by the community key leaders. They in turn know and trust the community key leaders. And they're at a relationship level where they're inviting each other to July 4th barbecues and children's christenings, et cetera. If you have that kind of relationship with the community, okay, then problems that potentially the intercession of government and or the police and or other agencies of government could help solve early will emerge early. Because you have that relationship, you'll hear about the problem sooner, where there's more opportunity for early intervention to fix the problem. And not only will the problem bubble up between the cop and the leader in the community, but good ideas about a solution to the problem will bubble up as well. And when you have that going on, the good ideas might be a bike patrol in an area, it might be a new neighborhood watch program, it might be something else. They'll naturally bubble up as solutions. But community policing is about that relationship. And so you're working at it all the time.
So you've been taking us on a tour on all these different nuances and facets of being a major city police chief. Is there a particular course or institute or something that prepares people to become a major city police chief, or is it just kind of subject to the individual experiences of that person?
Funny you say, Major Cities Chiefs, which is the organization for, I think, the top 120 or so largest police agencies in the United States and major cities. They actually tried for a period of time, and I don't know if they're still doing it. They tried a mentorship program for up and coming future police chiefs, where you would travel, like one of my commanders in Aurora spent a week with the chief in Houston, just shadowing the chief in Houston. So different agency, different state. So Major City Chiefs was doing that for a while. That is among the best things that you can do. I don't know if that program still exists. There are training courses, obviously, Southern Police Institute, FBI National Academy. There's programs like that. I think, frankly, that the best of them, which is a 3-week course run by the Police Executive Research Forum, is the uh, uh, SMIP, Senior Management Institute for Policing. It's the program that's run in the summers every year, and you send your senior leaders for 3 weeks of intensive training with a class of about 60 people. And a lot of experienced executives come in and talk, et cetera. And I've talked at that a couple times. That's really, really excellent. Expensive, but really, really excellent. So a big piece of it is chiefs have to be invested in mentoring up and coming leaders. And I think too late in my career, I realized that was an important function, of being a police chief, was to be investing in bringing people along. And I think towards the end of my time as a police chief, I was doing that fairly well, spending a lot of time with the most senior executives and the up and coming stars, and sending them to every school that I could send them to.
By the way, who did that for you? You mentioned Commissioner Bratton and other. Who did that for you?
Well, the NYPD had its own internal program called Police Management Institute, and if you were tapped, in the rank, I went through it at the rank of captain, but and they sent 15 people a year to that, and you formed a cohort, and now you had a network of folks as you move through this latter career. NYPD did that very smartly.
So Dan, what are you doing currently?
Well, I retired in 2019 in June, so just about 2 years ago. And interestingly enough, I've had consulting work kind of come my way without me marketing myself or working very hard. The 2 big projects I'm working on, one is I'm working with Bill Bratton. I'm teamed with Bill again. I'm part of a group that's counseling St. Louis County and St. Louis City around crime reduction with Teneo Risk Advisory. And, Bill is the the head of that outfit. And, I'm working with folks like Chuck Ramsey, Paul Evans. So it's a great team. And it's a real privilege to be involved in that. And it's an interesting role to be a consultant to police agencies and trying to help them reduce crime. Then the other big project is working for the Department of Justice, and I'm the team leader for training and technical assistance grant supporting Baltimore and Police Commissioner Mike Harrison and the City of Baltimore and its partners in their effort to reduce violent crime. So one's a privately funded effort, one's a government-funded effort, but it's classic law enforcement consulting. So it's been an adjustment, but I think on the whole it's fun. I've had a couple of other little efforts here and there where people have reached out to me for short-term projects. And then the other big thing is working as an ice hockey referee. I've played ice hockey all my life, and I always thought that I could referee well. So I went and got certified, and I'm learning that being a referee on ice hockey is very, very challenging. But it's a challenge I've accepted at this point in my life and having a lot of fun, mostly doing kids' games, some adult games, nothing too strenuous. Not doing high school or anything like that. And every game is a good skate. It's really good exercise, and I absolutely love to ice skate. So we'll see how long that lasts. But I found very humbling. Refereeing ice hockey is a lot harder than I thought it would be, even though I've played the game for over 40 years. So
wow. Well, Dan, I want to thank you again for spending time with us, being so generous with your time today and sharing your experiences, and also just to thank you for your service these many decades over, in a very difficult profession. So thank you for everything. We really appreciate it.
And Kumar, thank you for your friendship over the years.